All right, so get ready because today we are going on a deep dive. And I think we're going to connect some really interesting dots. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about Ma'at, that concept from ancient Egypt about cosmic order and justice. We've really gotten into all these different ancient cultures, from Egypt to Rome, even gone way back to Sumeria. And of course, we've talked about those biblical narratives too. And today we're going to use all of that to take a closer look at the story of Jesus, not just as, like a standalone story, but as like this piece of a much larger puzzle.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at it through this lens of cultures clashing, where you have law and order kind of bumping up against these like huge challenges.
Yeah, it's like Law and Order, but, with togas and chariots.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so if someone was suffering back in ancient Egypt,
Mm.
would they have seen that as like messing up this Ma'at? Like disrupting the balance somehow?
Not necessarily. It wasn't always about blaming the individual. It was more about how everyone else reacted to that suffering. Did they uphold Ma'at? Did they act justly and truthfully in response?
Oh, okay. Because the source points out that polytheism actually played a big role in all of this.
That's right. Because in a polytheistic system, you've got multiple gods who are in charge of different aspects of life.
Right?
So each profession or social role would have its own divine guardian, who is making sure everything was running smoothly and contributing to the overall order.
So it's like a divine system of checks and balances.
Exactly. You got it.
So like imagine you're a farmer back then. You've got a god of agriculture looking after your crops,
Right.
making sure you have
Yeah.
good harvest.
Right.
And then you've got another god making sure your business deals are fair.
It's like a whole team of divine specialists.
Right. And it kind of relates to that ADHD analogy the source brings up, even though it's a bit of an unusual comparison.
Yeah, it is a bit out there.
But it helps us understand, like, even if someone struggled with focus back then, they might have had their own personal deity to call on for help with that specific challenge.
Right. It shows how each deity could represent these very specific needs and roles within their society.
It's like having your own personal cheerleader in the heavens.
Exactly.
So you've got your god for farming, you've got your god for focus,
Right.
and so on and so forth. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is.
It gives us a glimpse into a totally different way of thinking about the world.
And a different way of organizing society.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, that polytheistic system,
Right.
your decisions, they weren't just like legal rulings, they had cosmic implications.
Yo.
You were essentially upholding Ma'at with like every judgment you made.
Wow. I never thought about it that way.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
And it's actually really interesting when you compare it to modern times.
How so?
Well, think about the huge responsibility judges have today. Their decisions impact lives, they shape communities. The weight of judgment, even though it's expressed differently, it's still there.
Yeah, that's true.
They're the ones deciding what's just and unjust suffering.
Right.
And in a polytheistic system, their authority is backed by the gods themselves.
Oh, I see. So it's like their decisions have this divine stamp of approval.
Exactly. It's a pretty powerful position to be in.
Yeah.
And it raises some questions about, the potential for abuse of power.
Right, because if they're the ones interpreting the will of the gods, what's to stop them from manipulating the system to their advantage?
That's a key question to consider.
What happens when that whole judgmental system gets too rigid?
That's a good question.
Like when the focus on order and control overshadows things like understanding and compassion.
Yeah, that's where things can get a bit dicey. The article argues that a system like that can be easily manipulated.
Oh, how so?
Well, power dynamics come into play, and suddenly judgment becomes less about justice and more about control.
Like people in power using it to silence anyone who disagrees with them.
Exactly. It becomes a tool to force people to conform a way to keep things the way they are.
And what happens when people feel like they're being judged unfairly?
Well, that's when you start to see rebellion brewing. People push back against that control.
Right, because everyone has their breaking point.
And history is full of examples of societies struggling with this tension between control and dissent.
It's like a constant tug of war.
Exactly.
Which brings us to like the most thought-provoking part of this whole article, the connection between the story of Jesus and the rise of iconoclasm.
Right. This is where the article gets really interesting. It suggests that the story of Jesus, with all the suffering and sacrifice, well, it kind of became a tool for a new kind of social control.
Really?
It's a complex idea, but it's super important for understanding how power dynamics shifted back then.
But couldn't, like, any powerful story be used that way?
That's a great question.
Like, what's so special about the Jesus narrative? Why was it so effective for iconoclasm?
The article argues that Jesus, through his suffering and death, he became like the ultimate symbol of suffering.
The ultimate icon of suffering.
Exactly. And that symbol was used to justify a whole new moral order.
So it wasn't just a story, it was like a blueprint for how to deal with dissent.
Right? Like if you disobeyed well, you were going against this ultimate sacrifice. It's this subtle shift from outward punishment to inward guilt and conformity.
Wow. So instead of exile or imprisonment, you have this like internalized control, this pressure to conform to the image of Jesus' suffering.
Yeah.
It's like a psychological form of power.
And it's super effective because it taps into those deep human emotions, guilt, shame, the desire to be accepted.
Yeah, those are powerful motivators.
It is definitely a much sneakier way of controlling people than any physical punishment could ever be.
And it makes you wonder, are we really that different today? I mean, do we still use powerful figures or symbols to manipulate and control people?
Oh, absolutely. Think about how politicians use historical narratives or national symbols to get people fired up and sway public opinion.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Or how marketing campaigns use like aspirational figures to sell products and lifestyles. It's all a form of iconoclasm, breaking down old beliefs and replacing them with new ones that fit a specific agenda.
It's kind of disturbing when you realize how much these ancient patterns of control are still at play in our modern world.
It is. It's like we've inherited this legacy of manipulation without even realizing it.
Yeah, and that's what makes this article so important. It gives us this new way of looking at the world, a way to see these subtle forms of control that are happening all around us.
You got it.
Okay, so let's recap for a sec. We started with this idea of divine justice in these ancient texts. Then we talked about the pressure on judges to uphold Ma'at, and how society shifted from using exile to using imprisonment as a way to control people. And then with the Jesus narrative, we see this emergence of iconoclasm, this like subtle manipulation of beliefs and values.
You nailed it.
And the article doesn't just leave us there. It challenges us to look at our own society and ask, have we really moved beyond these ancient patterns of judgment and control? Or have we just replaced the old gods with new ones?
That's the million-dollar question right there.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I had the answer. But it definitely makes you think. If we're constantly bombarded with messages telling us what to believe, how to behave, what to buy, are we really free? Or are we just living in a more sophisticated version of that ancient system of control? It's like we've traded those old tangible forms of control like exile and imprisonment for something way more insidious.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's almost like a control of the mind.
You hit the nail on the head. And that's the article's biggest challenge to us. Have we simply replaced those old gods, those external systems of authority with new ones? Have we internalized those systems of control, letting them shape our thoughts, beliefs, even our desires?
That's a pretty bleak thought. This is getting pretty heavy. But I think it's so relevant even today.
I agree.
It makes you think about how we perceive suffering in our own time. Is it always genuine? Or is there sometimes a hidden agenda at play?
Those are great questions to consider.
Yeah.
And the source goes on to explore this idea of subnational appropriation of a hostile force.
Whoa. Okay, that sounds complicated.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Essentially, it's saying that certain groups within a society might use the narrative of suffering to align themselves with an outside power,
Interesting.
maybe even an occupying force, and potentially benefit from that association.
So it's like playing both sides, claiming to be victims while also collaborating with the oppressors.
It's a complex dynamic for sure. And the source points out how this kind of behavior can further erode trust and create more division within a society.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It can be. And then there's this whole idea of personal benefits availed and provisioning justice.
Right. It seems like everyone's trying to get something out of this whole suffering situation.
It's a crucial point to consider. Who benefits from the way justice is dispensed? Is it truly about fairness and equity? Or are there hidden agendas at play?
You know, it reminds me of that saying, justice is blind. But it seems like more often than not, justice has its eyes wide open, and it's looking out for its own interests. It's kind of like we've uncovered this whole web of interconnected ideas.
Yeah, it's complex.
Yeah, from these ancient texts to the story of Jesus to the manipulation of suffering and the complexities of justice. It's a lot to process.
It is, but
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing is that suffering is this universal human experience. It's something we all face in one way or another.
But how we understand it and how we respond to it, that's shaped by all these social, political, and religious forces.
Exactly.
And as we've been talking about, those forces can be manipulated. It's not always about genuine compassion or a desire for true justice.
Right.
Sometimes it feels like there are other motives at play.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives that are presented to us
Right.
and ask ourselves who benefits from this story? Who's really in control?
It's like that saying, history is written by the victors.
Hmm.
We often only get one side of the story, and it's usually the side that serves the interests of those in power.
That's why it's so crucial to explore different perspectives, to dig into these ancient texts, to challenge our own assumptions about justice, suffering, and even the nature of belief itself. If suffering can be manipulated for political or personal gain, how can we tell the difference between genuine compassion and those calculated acts?
That's such a tough question, and one that feels so relevant in today's world.
It is. It's a question that requires a lot of reflection and discernment.
Like we need a moral compass to help us navigate this complex landscape of human experience.
Maybe we do. And perhaps by having these conversations, by really examining these stories that have shaped our world, we can start to develop that inner compass.
That's a great point. All right, so get this. We're diving into the Code of Hammurabi.
Ah, Hammurabi's Code.
Yeah, that huge stone pillar covered in laws, 282 to be exact.
It's an incredible piece of history.
But we're not just going to list them off, right?
Yeah, no.
We're going to go deeper. What does this code tell us about these ancient Sumerians? How did they see the world, human nature, all that? What were they worried about?
Yeah, I mean, just think about it. This thing has survived for thousands of years. What does that tell you?
Right. So let's start with the beginning, the prologue of the code. It's like straight up divine intervention. You've got Anu, Bel, Marduk,
Yeah.
all these big time gods.
A whole pantheon. And they're not just, hanging out. They're establishing this order, this hierarchy.
With Marduk at the top, right?
Yeah.
Like he's the chosen one.
Exactly. And that's super important because Marduk becomes the ruler of humanity. He's given that responsibility.
Okay, so we've got this connection between the gods and us humans right from the start. Why Marduk, though? What makes him so special in Sumerian mythology?
Well, Marduk's story is pretty wild. He doesn't just inherit power, he has to fight for it. He battles this, primordial chaos monster, Tiamat, and in doing so, he becomes the patron god of Babylon.
So it's like a cosmic underdog story.
Kinda, yeah. But think about what Hammurabi's doing here. He's connecting his laws to this epic narrative, to this idea of order overcoming chaos.
I see. So it's deeper than just don't steal your neighbor's sheep.
Way deeper.
It's like aligning human laws with this cosmic order established by the gods.
Exactly. And remember, life in ancient Mesopotamia was rough. Floods, droughts, invasions. It was constant chaos. So order was super precious. It was a big deal.
So by invoking Marduk, Hammurabi's saying, look, even the gods had to fight for order.
Right. And my laws.
They're part of that fight, part of keeping Marduk's peace.
It's a brilliant move, really.
That is a powerful message. Now, our sources also talk about these Anunnaki, these powerful beings, kind of it's just like this lost golden age when these divine beings kept everything running smoothly.
Exactly. And that's where the code comes in. You could almost see it as an attempt to fill the void left by the Anunnaki, to create a new order in a world where the gods have, stepped back.
Wow. That's a pretty heavy idea. It's not just about laws. It's about humans stepping up and making a just and stable society, even without direct divine rule.
Right. Humans taking on that responsibility.
Okay, so we've got this divine hierarchy, Marduk rising to power, the Anunnaki fading away. So this idea of suffering under an unfair system keeps coming up.
Absolutely. And it's not just these two stories. This theme of suffering under an unjust order appears all over ancient texts.
So it's like a universal human experience.
It really is. This search for meaning in the face of suffering, it transcends cultures, time periods. These narratives, they offer different perspectives on that struggle.
It's fascinating how those ideas, those human questions have resonated for so long.
Okay, so we've talked about gods and cosmic order and suffering and all that, but what about the actual laws? The nitty-gritty stuff that's in this code?
Yeah, let's get specific. What got you in trouble in ancient Babylon?
Well, the code covers a huge range of things, everything from business deals and property to family matters and crimes.
And I bet some of them are pretty surprising, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. One that always gets people is the eye for an eye principle, or I guess in this case it's more like bone for a bone.
Bone for a bone. Okay, I gotta hear this. What does that even mean?
So Law 196, it says, if a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye.
Yikes. Sounds pretty literal.
It was. And it goes on. A broken bone for a broken bone, tooth for tooth, any injury, you get the same thing done to you.
Wow. I mean, I guess that would definitely stop people from picking fights. But wouldn't everyone end up, missing teeth and limbs?
That's a good question. It's something scholars debate a lot. Was the code meant to be applied literally in every single case, or was there room for, like, judgment? Some think it was more of a set of guidelines that judges could consider the situation and maybe be more flexible with the punishments.
Okay, so not just straight up vengeance then. There was some thought put into it.
Right. The goal wasn't just to punish, but to establish a system, to make sure people were accountable for their actions.
To try and prevent things from spiraling into chaos.
Exactly. So the code outlines the consequences and hopefully keeps people from just lashing out.
So like a framework for resolving conflicts, even if some of the punishments seem harsh to us now.
Right. And this leads us to another interesting part of the code. Its focus on family.
Okay, families. Huge in ancient Babylon.
Huge. They were like the foundation of society. And the code have all these rules about marriage, divorce, inheritance, how to treat children.
So what were some of the big rules for family life?
Well, marriage was a big deal, legally binding contract, and dowries were important. The property a woman brought into the marriage.
Right.
If the husband died, that dowry usually went back to her family unless she had sons.
So having sons was pretty important for a woman's security. Sounds kind of unfair, honestly.
It reflects a patriarchal society for sure, where men had most of the power, but the code did offer some protection for women in certain situations. Like, if a husband was abusive or neglectful, the wife could seek a divorce.
Oh, interesting. So there were ways to address those imbalances, at least a little bit.
Right, and that's what makes studying this code so fascinating. It's not just black and white, good and bad. It shows us how a society was trying to figure things out, how to create a system that worked, even if it wasn't perfect.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into their lives, their struggles, their values, how they dealt with the same problems we face today, in a way.
Absolutely. And that brings us to some of the more, shall we say, intense parts of the code. The offenses that were considered really, really bad in Babylonian society.
Okay, like what could get you in serious trouble back then?
Well, incest was completely forbidden, as was adultery, especially for the wife.
And the punishments.
Severe. We're talking death by drowning or burning.
Whoa, okay.
Mm.
They were not messing around. But why so harsh? Why those specific offenses?
Well, remember, family was everything. Anything that threatened that undermined the social order, it was seen as a huge problem.
And with no prisons or anything like we have today, swift and severe punishment was the way to maintain order.
Right. It was about deterring others, making an example. So yeah, those laws definitely reflect their values and priorities. And while we might not agree with all of them, they show us how they were trying to deal with the challenges of their time.
Yeah, it's amazing how these ancient laws can give us insight into their whole worldview. So one thing I've been thinking about is punishment, how it's changed over time. We don't have bone for a bone anymore, thank goodness. So how did we go from that to the systems we have today?
Yeah, that's a big question. It seems like a huge jump from bone for a bone to, everything we have now. How did we get here?
Well, it was a long process. It took centuries as societies changed and grew. But one of the biggest shifts was going from exile as punishment to imprisonment.
So instead of kicking people out, they started locking them up. Why the change?
There were a few reasons. First, as empires got bigger and more complex, exile just wasn't practical anymore. You couldn't just banish someone to the wilderness when the wilderness was part of your empire.
Right. Makes sense. Plus, imprisonment offered more control. You could try to reform people, make them better. That fit with how ideas about punishment were evolving.
So it wasn't just about revenge anymore.
Exactly. This idea of rehabilitation, of trying to change behavior and bring people back into society, that started to become more important.
That's a pretty big shift in thinking. But it makes you wonder, does imprisonment actually work that way? I mean, we still see people reoffending after they get out. It's tough to reintegrate back into society.
That's a really important point. Both exile and imprisonment have their downsides. Exile might seem simpler, but it creates outcasts who can become dangerous. Imprisonment, it's supposed to control and reform, but it can also isolate people, dehumanize them.
Yeah, and that can lead to more problems down the line.
Right. Finding a system that's truly just and effective, that's something we're still struggling with.
It's about finding a balance, right? Accountability, keeping people safe, but also showing compassion. Well, there you have it, folks. Another deep dive complete. We've explored these ancient texts, uncovered some hidden meanings,
Mm.
and hopefully challenge our own assumptions along the way.
Yeah.
We want to leave you with that question to ponder. How do you discern genuine compassion from those calculated acts? Think about it, discuss it with others, and keep the conversation going.
Until next time, keep diving deep.